पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschit dukha bhag bhavet. Sarvastaratu durgani sarvo bhadrani pashyatu. Sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good. And may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the Divine Presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So we are continuing the study of the Bhakti Sutras. We were on Sutra number 5. Let's read that sutra again together. Yat prapya na kinchit vanchati na shochati na dveshti na ramate notsahi bhavati. After obtaining which devotion, the devotee does not desire anything else, does not grieve, does not hate anything, does not enjoy anything else, and does not feel encouraged to do anything else. So this was the sutra we have been studying, and last week we saw the significance of a bhakta, a devotee, not desiring anything. What role desires play in our life, and how desirelessness can come. How do we know which desires are right, which desires are wrong, and the desires that are self-destructive in nature, the desires that tend to provoke us into actions that somehow weaken us, either physically, mentally, morally, and so on. How do we try to master these and not yield to them? And in that connection, we saw that awareness of the fleeting nature of life, how everything is so temporary, evanescent, helps. We also saw the role the willpower plays in, that if my will is under my control, then I get to decide which of the desires to say yes to and which of the desires to say no to. We also saw that ultimately the mental impressions, samskaras, from which all desires emerge, have to be burnt up. And this burning occurs in Bhakti Yoga through the grace of God, and in Jnana Yoga through the power of knowledge. And finally, we saw the trying to maintain the awareness that God is always present, that God is always near me, watching me, helps prevent not only the feeling of loneliness that can sometimes come in our lives, that we know we are never really alone because God is always with us, but also it helps us deal with the role, the power of desires in our life. So that was the first thing that was mentioned in this sutra. A devotee does not desire anything else. The next thing says, does not grieve. The word in Sanskrit is shochati. It's from the noun shoka. Now, grief comes, there is another word called sorrow, often translated as dukkha. Now, there is a difference between sorrow and grief, the way these terms are used here. We all experience joy and sorrow in life. Happiness comes to us, unhappiness also comes to us. Now, the experience of both joy and sorrow in life is a result of past karma. That is something that we have contributed in some form. We cannot always say which form exactly we contributed it and how long or when, but there's something that we have contributed in some form which has led to my present experience of joy or sorrow. But grief is something different. Not all people who experience sorrow necessarily grieve over it. Grief is our reaction to the experience of sorrow in our life. And this reaction occurs partly because we forget that the true nature of the spirit is joy, that my real being, what is experiencing sorrow, are both my body and mind. But my real being spirit is free, is not a part of the body and mind. It's separate from it. But my forgetfulness of that fact makes me react to that sorrow. And that reaction to the sorrow often takes the form of grief. Just as reacting to the experience of happiness can lead me to a word that is used in Sanskrit called moha, a kind of delusion, a kind of I think delusion is the only word that comes to mind right now. So shoka and moha, grief and kind of a delusion, are the result of, not the result of, but our reaction to joy and sorrow in life. The moha or the delusion occurs when we experience happiness is because we mistake that the happiness that is being experienced in the body and mind to be same as the bliss of the Atman. So there is that delusion that is occurring, mistaking one thing for another. And in responding to sorrow, we are actually forgetting that the sorrow is related to the body and mind and not to the spirit. So don't worry too much about these technicalities, but enough to know that experiencing joy and sorrow in life are themselves not so problematic as reacting to the joy and sorrow that we experience in life. If we stop reacting, we can just be a witness. Just as on some days it's a nice sunny day, and some days are cloudy days. But we know that clouds don't remain forever. They come and they go. So similarly, if the sunny day is equivalent to a joyful day and a cloudy day is a sad day, we know neither of these two are constant. Clouds come and then they depart. So similarly, a devotee of God can be a witness. Joys will come in life and pass. Sorrows will come and pass. And we can just observe them. The moment I react to either of these two, I get caught. So if we don't want to get caught, all that we need to do is to be a witness. And that is what one in whose heart this bhakti, this love has truly entered, such a person therefore does not grieve. Because such a person has learned not to react to these passing experiences in life. So while it is great that sorrows don't remain permanently, but it should also make us a little bit more grounded to know that happiness doesn't live permanently either. So just recognizing that neither of these two are permanent, we can try to remain grounded, so to speak. The third thing is, does not hate anything, na dveshti. Now, there is a lot to be spoken about hatred. It's one of the major hurdles in spiritual life, but it's also in social life. We see a lot of the social evils and challenges we have faced in the past and we are continuing to face today. A lot is based in hatred. And so therefore we need to look a little bit more deeply at this whole topic about hatred. Now, hatred, it's possible to say, is at least of two major kinds. One kind of hatred is, you could say it's contingent, that is, it is objective. And the other kind of hatred is existential or subjective. Now, contingent hatred or objective hatred usually is temporary. Sometimes it can be lifelong, and it is directed towards people or situations or institutions in life, and oftentimes caused by some obstruction of desire in our lives. So I want something, and if there is an obstruction to it, whoever is causing that obstruction, whoever is placing hurdles in my path, if I'm strong enough to remove it, I remove it. If I'm not strong enough to remove it, I hate it. And so that's the basic reason for this hatred towards objects. And those objects could be people and so on. And most of the time, a little bit of reflection. We don't need too much reflection for it. Most people are aware of this kind of hatred. And that's why people say, I hate that, I hate this. So they know exactly who they hate and why they hate. So we are aware of the object of hatred, and that hatred usually comes from a hurdle in my wanting something and that hurdle not allowing me to get it. Now this kind of hatred is often removed through the preliminary stages of bhakti. So if someone on the path of devotion, the early stages of bhakti, and we will come to that, what those stages are. But those early stages of bhakti, when we try to live with a certain discipline, a certain sets of do's and don'ts of how a bhakta should live, what a bhakta should do, how a bhakta should think. So these kind of preliminary disciplines are often sufficient to take care of this kind of objective hatred. We've already seen how a bhakta becomes free from desire. And so since a devotee learns how to deal with desires, a devotee also learns how to deal with the hurdles to the desire. So it's kind of connected. But there is another kind of hatred which is internal, which is subjective. And that's a little bit more tough. It's more tough because it's more subtle. Hating people and objects and things outside is a little bit easy because there are visible objects and we know the problem. We also know what can be done. We may not always succeed in doing it, but at least we know what we can do about it. But what about this inner subjective hatred? Now, this subjective hatred is sometimes called existential form of hatred. Existential because it exists in all. It's universal. Just by the fact that we are human beings, the seeds of this inner hatred, if you like, are present in us all. Now, this hatred can often manifest as a kind of a general feeling of antagonism toward life in general, not toward any particular person or any particular place. It's just like you just feel antagonistic toward life itself. It doesn't seem to have any definite external cause for it. And oftentimes we see, therefore, that many people who have this are usually unaware of it. They are not satisfied. They just seems like some kind of an anger always within them. There is not that feeling of contentment and joy and just being at peace with oneself isn't there. And oftentimes people are not even aware of why this feeling of anger and hatred, in however subtle a form, is present within me. Now, sometimes this kind of an inner, very subtle form of hatred can sometimes become contingent, sometimes and get directed outside. And then that usually takes the form of to fanaticism or racial hatred. So even people whom we say are racists, or people who we say just hate other groups, other people, intense form of hatred. In many cases, that external hatred is only an outer projection of the inner hatred. So there is a subtle thing going on, and because the person is unaware of it, it gets projected outside. It's sometimes you will see that sometimes if someone is very unhappy, and they might, and sometimes it happens in maybe when we are teenagers, but even when we are older, this inner kind of anger and thing, people will just go and smash something on the table or kick the chair away. Now, it's not like, why are they hating that chair? What has that poor chair done? Nothing. There is something is going on inside, and it just finds an expression in doing some external act. So that's why sometimes these extreme forms of fanaticism and hatred outside can be traced back to that inner commotion, inner chaos within. Shankaracharya mentions that all hatred comes from seeing something as different from oneself and hence bad. Now that's the basic Vedantic position, that the root cause of this existential form of hatred especially is that the moment I see something as different from me, there is, no matter what people might say, there is no one we love more in this world than ourselves. So, and then we also love those things which we see as connected with me or mine. So either it should be me or mine. Usually we tend to love them. The moment something becomes the other, then I may not always hate it, but at least there is a theoretical possibility that if that other somehow becomes an obstacle in some form, I'm going to hate it. So the root of all hatred is this separating of things and people from me. And therefore, the word that gets often used, especially in psychology, is self-alienation. Alienating oneself from others. And it's this self-alienation that is the primary cause of this subjective form of hatred. And as I said, it's existential. So external hatred we all can understand. But this internal hatred is very subtle. It may not express itself outwardly in a very visible forms always. The root cause of fear and hatred that we have is really this self-alienation. So self-alienation produces hatred for oneself, and then this is what gets projected outside as hatred for life in general. Now this is also of three kinds. So the first kind of self-alienation is the alienation of the conscious part of ourselves from the unconscious part. We know in psychology oftentimes the mind kind of is seen as with two compartments at least. There is the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. Oftentimes it is said that the extent of the mind that we are conscious of, our own mind, may be 2 or 3%. This might sound terrible, but about 98% or 97% of our own mind is not always accessible to us. A lot of it is like the basement is larger than the main thing. And that's why sometimes suddenly some thoughts will come in the mind, some emotions will come. And we will wonder like, where did this thought come from? Where did this idea come from? And we sometimes might think, oh, it came from that, I heard it there, or I read about it, or and so on. But not necessarily. A lot of these ideas and emotions which suddenly seem to pop up in the mind are not like floating about in the atmosphere and we catch them. A lot of it is really in our own mind. But it's been there for long, and we have just like, oftentimes we never go to our basements or garage for a long time. If you're just kind of dumping all of stuff there, we don't feel like going there. A lot of time we ourselves don't know what's in our basement. So similarly, a lot of these thoughts and emotions in the unconscious part, we are not aware. And we are surprised then of sometimes when they come up on the conscious surface, we are surprised. So this conscious part has gotten alienated, separated from the unconscious part. And it is this separation of the unconscious from conscious that is the primary cause of the feeling of insecurity and fear. That's how it often manifests itself. Now, there are two ways that people react to this. Or this is the two ways we respond to it. So this kind of a separation from the conscious from the unconscious, it may either make a person people to isolate themselves and develop a kind of a very protective attitude because we are feeling insecure. We isolate and then we kind of build walls around us. And then this often leads to the symptoms that we sometimes recognize as a form of selfishness. People are very selfish, they just kind of close, they just want to be protective about themselves. Not so much caring for others because they are very insecure inside. So selfishness, sometimes depression, it can also take a form of kind of a morbid form of introversion. To be introspective is great. To be deep within oneself is fine. But this kind of a morbid idea of introversion that not because I'm being very contemplative, but it's just that I'm very insecure. So I just kind of close all the doors and windows and just don't feel like going out of my house. In the same way, I just close all the doors and windows of my personality and don't want to go out. So that's one way this kind of alienation may manifest in some people. And in some other people, it can manifest through trying to forget this lower self and then kind of just go and identify with society. It's like, well, I can't deal with this. It's a little bit like sometimes people, the home may no longer be so a welcoming place. So if it's no longer a welcoming place, people would want to avoid going home. And then they will want to spend as much time outside the home as possible. So if inside of me is this already conscious and unconscious are separated, I don't feel happy looking inside. And therefore I don't want to deal with myself. And so what happens is sometimes people then will try to spend as much time as possible with others. And this can take the form of then a kind of what I would like to call as which looks like selflessness, but maybe a false selflessness. In other words, I can be very helpful to other people, try to solve other people's problems, not so much because I love them, but because if I don't keep myself busy trying to solve other people's problems, then I'll have to come back and try to solve my own. And I don't want to deal with my problems. So the only way I don't want to deal with my own problems is to then keep myself busy trying to help and solve other people's problem. So this kind of an aggressive form of unselfishness is a little bit problematic. As they say, the Boy Scouts were told to do one good turn every day. And then, I think this is a story I've told many times before. I'm going to inflict on you one more time. So they were asked at the next scout meeting, so what good turn did you do yesterday? And so the first boy gets up and says, I helped an old woman cross the street. And then the second one gets up and says, well, I helped that woman to cross the street. So five of them get up and say they helped that same woman cross the street. And then Scout said, why do you need five of you to help one woman cross the street? And they said, well, she did not want to cross the street. But these people wanted to help some elderly person cross the street. So they just... So that's what I mean by sometimes you'll find people like that who are more eager to help you, and you are not so much in need of their help, but they just want to help you whether you like it or not. So that's sometimes what happens when we don't want to deal with our own issues. We busy ourselves with the issues of other people. Or sometimes it can manifest through kind of a restless activity. Some people say, oh, I can never sit still. I'm always working. Now, if you always have so much work, that's fine. But sometimes, again, we don't want to sit still, because if I sit still, then I'll have all these problems to deal with, and I don't want to deal with it. So I need to find some way to keep myself busy. And that's another way it manifests. It can also manifest through over-intellectualism. It's like go to a library and bring some 25 books and read it. Or if you've finished one PhD, do another PhD. The reason is, let me keep myself busy with anything so that I will not have to deal with my problems. So these are the many different ways in which this alienation of the conscious from the unconscious manifests. Now, how do we deal with it? Self-analysis definitely helps. So again, doing it in a proper way, of course, not just kind of a haphazard brooding over oneself, that will not help. So kind of a systematic way of analyzing one's situation, one's needs, one's hopes, one's fears, gives us some amount of clarity to deal with it. doing service, and a truly selfless service, by that I mean, not that aggressive form of service that I referred to. Uh, Trying to help without calculating one's own self-interest, a service done with the spirit of karma yoga, that also helps in dealing with this kind of alienation. And of course, the guidance from one's own teacher. So these three things: self-analysis, service in the spirit of karma yoga, and guidance from a teacher, from some trusted source, is very helpful in dealing with this first kind of alienation of the conscious from the unconscious. This separation of the conscious from the unconscious is sometimes what is called as psychological disintegration, since it's dealing with the mind. And so when this alienation is removed to a large extent, such a person becomes more psychologically integrated. And this is very important. If the more this alienation occurs, the more difficult spiritual life will be. So one of the primary requirements, even to begin spiritual life in a meaningful way, is try to minimize this alienation of the unconscious from the conscious. And so, in other words, it's kind of good to visit our basement now and then, and good to know what is inside us, the good and the bad. It's not just that the basement has only terrible things, it has some wonderful things too. So our mental impression, there will be some very healthy, powerful thoughts, images, ideas, which we have received in our life, and about which we may have forgotten. Sometimes people go and buy stuff from Amazon, and after it arrives, then you find, oh, I already bought it 5 years ago, and it was just lying and I had forgotten about it. So it does happen. So there are a lot of really wonderful things have happened in our life, about which we may have completely forgotten. But now and then visiting, trying to go back and think about the past, we may be able to kind of recover these wonderful things. The reason we often hesitate from doing that is that even when we find these wonderful things, we may also find other things which are not so wonderful. Things which we kind of filed away in some basement and said, I'm never going to think about it again. Unfortunately, it's not so easy to throw it away, because the subtle impressions are still there of the things we don't want to think about it. But if spiritual life is being open and transparent, then we will have to clean up our basement. See, if there are things that are not so positive, things that are painful, we may have to find a way to get rid of them in some way. It doesn't all, just like you don't have to clean your basement in one day, but we have to start working at it. So similarly, we don't have to clean this whole thing one day. It's not possible, it's not even advisable. But as and when we get strong enough, stronger to deal with our own past, with our own subtle things in our own heart, we need to kind of get them out, bring them in the bright light of conscious mind. If they are good, keep it. If they are bad, throw it. But to even decide what to keep and what to throw, we must first kind of bring them and become conscious of them. So that brings about a psychological integration. The second kind of alienation is between the psyche. By psyche, I'm using the term in a sense of both the entire mind, conscious and unconscious, the separation of the mind from the spirit, the inner spirit. So first there is the separation of the conscious mind from the unconscious mind. The second kind of alienation is the separation from the mind itself from the inner spirit. Now this kind of separation again is present in all and worldly people especially or not even aware of it. But spiritual life, in a real sense, begins only when we become aware of this separation. We are aware of our physical identity, we are aware of our mind, intellect, and so on, but we also have kind of, however hazy, a glimpse of the spirit. It may still be intellectual in the beginning, but we know that there is something more than the body and mind. And we also realize the gulf that is created, that my true spirit is somehow gotten separated from the mind. So this separation, this alienation of the mind from the inner self, that's the second kind of alienation. And this alienation, as I said, we become aware of only when we consciously turn to spiritual life. Now, this also can manifest in two different ways in the lives of spiritual seekers. One way is that we become hazily aware, kind of a dimly aware of the glory of the Spirit, that the divine in our own heart, God sitting in our own heart. There is a kind of a very dim awareness of that. And then that awareness of the presence of something sacred, holy within us, inspires us to become more pure, to become more divine, to become truly a child of God. So one way spiritual seekers respond to this awareness of separation of the spirit from the mind is this a very conscious struggle to become truly a child of God. So devotees of Ramakrishna and Holy Mother, for instance, we often say, I'm a child of the Holy Mother. No, it's not enough to say it. But if in my life, having read the life of Ramakrishna, having read the life of Sharada Devi, if there is this intense thing, I want to be a true child of the Mother. I want to be a true child of Ramakrishna, or true child of the Buddha, true child of whoever we worship. So somehow trying to be more, manifest the divine in our own heart is one way of responding to this feeling of estrangement from the inner soul. A second way of responding is we become acutely aware of how worthless this lower self or ego is. Maybe a few years ago, before we turned to spiritual life in a serious way, the same ego about which we were so proud or so vain, after we turned to spiritual life, we suddenly recognize its limitations. We suddenly recognize it's quite worthless, considering the true glory of our true existence. And recognizing that, then, an intense struggle to rise above that lower self, that not become trapped in one's own ego trips, if you like, but try to rise above it. So these are the two ways a person might respond to this kind of an alienation. Now, this alienation, oftentimes in the lives of spiritual seekers, can manifest as the conflict that we experience between spiritual life and worldly life, or secular life and spiritual life. And then the conflict always involves then, well, I want to be spiritual, but I have secular responsibilities. And how much time should I give for this? How much time should I give for that? How do I strike a balance? Do I need to strike a balance? So these kind of conflicts can sometimes come, and these result from this alienation that is being experienced of the mind from the spirit. sometimes it can manifest also through very excessive austerity measures. Austerity is great. Sometimes a kind of an inner discipline in spiritual life is very helpful. But anything taken to an unreasonable degree become problematic. I mean, even too much of good, it's like well, certain vitamins say, well, this vitamin is good for you. Well, it's good for you, but there is a certain amount that's good for you. If I just eat nothing but just only that vitamin, then it could be poisonous. So austerity, self-discipline is great. But if my self-discipline just takes the form of, oftentimes, a kind of a self-torture, and in sometimes it has happened, if you can read it in both fiction and non-fiction. Sometimes this way of torturing one's own body and to kind of say, I'm doing it out of love for God. And that's a problem. And this is the result from this kind of an alienation people experience. So how do we deal with this? So this kind of alienation is dealt often, or in fact is removed only when the true inner self is awakened. By awakened, I mean, Swami Vivekananda once called it, he said something similar, I'm not quoting the exact words. Truth will come, purity will come, love will come, all of these things will come in our lives when the self is roused to self-conscious activity. That's very important. That it's not enough that only when we are studying Vedanta now and then to remember, oh, I'm the spirit. How often am I able to, even first to begin with intellectually, with the force of will, to remember my spiritual identity? Either philosophically is that I'm the spirit, or even in devotional terms, I'm a child of God. I'm a devotee of God. As I go through my day's activities from morning to night, and as we embrace all the different roles in life that we have, as a son or a daughter or a father or a mother, a husband, a wife, and the different positions we hold in our offices, as a teacher or lawyer or doctor and so on, how often do I remember that even when I'm carrying out all these roles, there is this role of a devotee, a child of a God. That, how often do I remember? It's not impossible. I can be doing whatever my duty demands of me in the course of the day. What prevents me from thinking in the part of my mind, I'm a child of God, I'm a devotee of God, or I'm a spirit. You pick whatever comes naturally to you. But something that is connected with my spiritual life, it's not incompatible. So doing the so-called secular activities, it is possible to maintain a spiritual identity. They are not incompatible. You can be a boss in your workplace and be a child of God in your heart. Not incompatible, it's possible to do it. The more we are able to do it, first we'll have to use our willpower to affirm our spiritual identity throughout the day. But gradually, through practice, and this needs practice and this needs perseverance. We'll fail, we'll often forget. That's okay. But instead of getting discouraged, if I try to remember it, gradually then, especially in the beginning, during the time of prayer or meditation, it will be easier then that there may be moments, a few seconds, later on a few minutes, and so on, when you will forget your body and mind. When you are praying and meditating, you will not even have to say, I am spirit. That will just be who you are. Right now, we don't have to say, how often do we say, I am a human being? We don't have to say it. We just know it. So just as being a human being is like, well, that's who I am. I don't have to affirm it. Exactly in the same way, there will be moments in life I will know I'm a divine spirit. I don't have to say it, but that's who I am. So this, even though in the beginning it might be intellectual, even though in the beginning we'll have to use our willpower to do it, if I continue with this practice, a day will come when that truth will actually be experienced. And when that, and that's what I mean by this inner self being awakened. That means I become aware of it in a very intense way. When that happens, this second form of alienation will go away. And then finally, and I'll deal with this very briefly, the third and the last kind of alienation is this alienation of this inner self from the Supreme Self. The inner self and the Supreme Self is Paramatma, or God. So the alienation of the devotee from God. Now, in advanced spiritual seekers, this always happens. So this, only when this inner spirit is awakened in us, then we'll even become aware of this higher form of alienation. And in advanced spiritual seekers, it takes the form of either intense love for God. That love, it doesn't have any rules. You can see that in the Ramakrishna's case. In the beginning, when he was a priest, he had to do all those puja and everything following certain rules. But then later, he didn't reject the rules or anything. But somehow, this natural love for God filled his heart to such an extent, it went beyond all rules. And all rules get transcended then. Or a second way, this last stage get manifested is through an intense longing for liberation. And when this higher form of alienation is experienced, it can sometimes take the form of an intense form of helplessness in some ways. We see in the life of Sri Ramakrishna, in the beginning, before he had that first vision of the Divine Mother, he was so much longing for it that as the day was about to end and he would see the setting of the sun and he would say, one more day has gone and I have not yet had the vision of Mother. And it was so painful. He would be just lying on the ground and kind of rubbing his face, and the whole face would be bloodied. I mean, it's not surprising that a lot of people thought he was crazy. They couldn't understand the state he was in. So that's what happens. That intense separation that is felt. In Christian theology, it is this state of helplessness that gets sometimes described as the dark night of the soul. And all great, not all, but many great mystics and saints have passed through these stages. And of course, when this alienation is removed, that's when the goal of bhakti is reached. And that's what Narada is referring to here. Such a person does not hate anything. There is a lot to think about hatred. And once this love of God fills our heart, all these forms of hatred, whether objective or subjective, from the different kinds of ways our inner being has gotten fractured, so to speak, separated, all of these broken pieces come together and then we become whole again. That's what love means. Hatred is what separates things. Love is what brings it all together. And therefore, this path of love, divine love, will bring all these different parts of our personality, which have apparently gotten separated from one another, together again. And that is what is meant by such a person does not hate anything. So we will stop here today, and the rest of the sutra we will take up next Wednesday. Do you have any ideas, thoughts? Yes, Akshay.
So Swamiji, I've sometimes heard hate the sin, not the sinner. Have you heard that before?
Say that again.
Hate the sin, not the sinner.
Yeah.
So kind of righteous hatred, I guess, of something that, you know, for instance, with like alcoholism, like hating the alcoholism, not the alcoholic.
Yeah.
Is that kind of hate also transcended through Bhakti Yoga?
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to use the word hate. First of all, I know it sounds great, hate the sin, not the sinner. Not always easy. I mean, it's very catchy to put it that way. But think about it this way. You say war on terror. Now again, this kind of becomes such a common term. We use it all the time, and now we just kind of take it for granted. We think we understand. But terror is a noun. Someone says, well, how can you have a war on a noun? So you think of, we have no idea of what terror is or what it can do unless we actually see it manifested through some person whom we then call a terrorist. So similarly, I understand the sense in which it is said, hate the sin and not the sinner. But since we're trying to look at it from a psychological point of view, I would say hating the sin is also not a very happy remedy, because still the seed of hatred is still in my heart. I'm not really removing that hatred. I'm just redirecting my hatred from this to this. But I'm not really dealing with that hateful tendency within me. I'm just changing the object of that hateful tendency. As sometimes people say, if you're angry, go take a pillow and kind of punch at the pillow. Well, that's better than going out and punching someone else. I mean, I understand that. But on the other hand, every time I get angry and I go into a room and start punching a pillow, I'm not really solved the problem. Because that seed of anger is still there. I'm just changed the object. And maybe I'm causing less harm externally. Maybe I'm not really doing so much damage other than the poor pillow is going to get all the blows. But I'm not solved the problem. So I think from a psychological standpoint, hating anyone won't solve the problem. I need to remove that seed of hatred altogether. Okay?
And one last question, Swamiji, can you comment on self-love? I think we had mentioned that we talked about...
We'll come to that.
Okay.
We'll come to that, yeah. We'll come to that, yeah.
Swamiji, this thought came, correct me if I'm wrong, we always try to put anger, hatred as a negative, and happy is positive. But for my own experience, that sometimes I'm very happy with the worldly things, and then I get mad, and that angers brings me back to where I really want to be. So I use my anger as a positive. So how do you explain that? Is anger is always bad, and be happy with which you are not supposed to be, but samskara is there and it kind of dragged me, and so is that a positive?
The goal is to eliminate anger and hatred and all these negative things. Now, if we can eliminate them straight away, that's fine. Oftentimes, eliminating them, kind of slaying them, so to speak, may not be easy, and it is not easy. Therefore, what Sri Ramakrishna taught was you redirect them. You change their direction. And so he said, instead of projecting your anger towards other people and things, be angry at the obstacles in your path. Be angry at anger itself, if you like. Because anger itself is an obstacle. If instead of being greedy for the evanescent, temporary, fleeting things of the world, let me be greedy for God's love. So all of these things, which are oftentimes used in negative sense, can become helpful if I kind of change their direction. So that's one way of trying to deal with it, at least in the initial stages. Okay. Yeah, that's the.
Swamiji, in regards to self-alienation, how would you contrast doing self-analysis versus doing japa? Are both complementary, or do you need both? Or
Oh, both are complementary. They are not. We need self-analysis. Don't do self-analysis while you're doing japa. Yeah, they're two separate practices, and they will help each other. Yeah, sure.
Swamiji, so I'm just sharing my personal work with my own little anger that I have when I ride on a bicycle on the roads and somebody almost hits me. So that happens a lot. And I always, so in the beginning I judged myself, oh, you know, this negative thoughts, you know, I almost cursed on the person and all those things. But then I just step back, I acknowledge it, I become a witness to what has happened, and I just let it go. And if that happens next day or in a week, of course, my first reaction would be try not to have this reaction. But if the situation is really dangerous, and probably the only way to avoid this type of anger is like stop being on a bicycle or like stop driving. But yeah, if you could just tell me what you think.
No, it can be difficult because these are all called, some habits get formed inside, and it's not easy to remove them overnight. But the more you continue doing the kind of analysis you're doing, without thinking that it's impossible to get rid of it, because it is possible. It may take time. But you might find that over time, the instances when you get angry might become fewer and fewer. So it may not happen, the change will not happen overnight, but it's very gradual, but it's possible. Because you see, eventually if you have to let it go, why not let it go right away? You know, that's the idea.
And what helps me a lot is being in the shoes of that other person who can, I mean, the driver, for example, that didn't look in the mirror. So just being compassionate to, you know, them being ignorant at that moment, and that they didn't do it on purpose. So, but at the same time, working on my own emotions. So, which is
That's true.
Swamiji, I think you have mentioned earlier lectures about the existential sorrow. I can understand a little bit that, okay, we are alienated from God, so we have some kind of sorrow in us. But why do we have existential hatred? How did it come?
Now, as Shankara explains that when I separate myself from others, when I separate myself from anything, then that thing becomes the other. It's no longer me because I'm already separated from it. And if that thing in some way becomes an obstacle or a hurdle to me, then I'm going to hate it. So at the root of all hatred is separation. And that's why in a state of deep sleep, we don't hate anyone because we are not separating from anyone. In a state of deep sleep, there is no insecurity, there is no hatred, there is nothing, because there is no separation. But all of these things are present. Every time we are aware of things and people, etc., apart from us, we cannot but react to it. And it doesn't always have to be hatred. Well, it can come through attachment, it can come through love, it can come to hatred. But we are always going to react to things that are other than me. That's the idea.
So, Swamiji, you mentioned that sorrow and joy come from past karma. So is our true self sorrow and joy, or only joy?
Of?
When we think of our true self, does our true self, is it composed of both sorrow and joy, or
No.
only is there a state of joy?
The karma affects only body and mind. Karma doesn't affect the self at all. So the self, neither joy nor sorrow come to it. But the nature of the self itself is joy. That is what Satchidananda means. So that Ananda, the bliss that the spirit has intrinsically in it, that is not coming from outside. But the body and mind, whatever joy and sorrow they feel, the cause of their joy and sorrow is outside of themselves. Okay, last question. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just in this sutra, they says about activities, and you have to detach from the activities. How can you be, when you're concentrated and you're doing the activities, how can you be detached from that?
No, don't be detached from the activity you are engaged in. Be detached from other activities when you're doing this activity. Because the main problem is the lack of concentration really means I'm doing something but thinking of something else. So when you're doing something, be fully attached to it and detached from everything else. Then when this activity is over, be detached from this and attached to whatever it is next you're doing. So it's not just about detachment, it's both. Attaching and detaching, but at our will. We get to decide where I should attach and where I should detach from. Right now, we are not deciding it. Our mind is deciding it. That's the problem. Because concentration is really nothing but attachment. You are attaching fully to something, and concentration is the source from which all knowledge comes. So although sometimes we look upon attachment as something terrible, it is said in a specific sense. We do need attachment, but attachment to whatever we are engaged in at that moment. Our whole being must be attached to it and nothing else. But when that activity is over, we should have the power to detach ourselves fully from it and attach to whatever it is that we are doing next. So that is the ability we need to have. So we'll continue with this discussion when we meet next week on Sutra number 5. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. Last Sunday, for satsang, our subject was questions about the world. So next Sunday, that is, our subject will be questions about the self, questions about me, the one me who is experiencing the world. So this topic will be questions about me again, not me. And next Wednesday, we will continue the study, the Narada Bhakti Sutra, and on Tuesday and Saturday, our Arati and meditation will also continue as usual. So let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.